Diddy, once the untouchable king of hip-hop, just broke down in court. And what triggered it? Prosecutors just dropped new charges so shocking, so devastating that they might just seal his fate forever. This courtroom moment wasn't just emotional, it was historic. And everyone inside the courtroom felt it. Silence, tension, and then disbelief. Let's get into it. Sources inside the courtroom say Diddy looked like a man who had just seen his entire empire fall apart right in front of his eyes.
A major development in the Sean Combs criminal case. The defense accuses the government of trying to introduce brand new evidence that they say will not only severely prejudice Combs, but this could potentially delay this whole trial. We have a major issue leading up to Sean Combs' racketeering, sex trafficking, prostitution trial scheduled to begin May 5th. Actually, it is so significant that not only could it change the course of this whole case, but I wonder if we're dealing with a situation that could actually delay this trial. So if you've been following our coverage here on Sidebar, you know there has been a whole lot of back and forth between Combs' defense counsel and prosecutors about who's going to testify at this upcoming trial, particularly the alleged victims, and when the prosecutors have to disclose the identities of these individuals. Well, it is that issue that has now raised up again, and this is a monumental potential problem. I'm going to start with one of the defense's filings from yesterday, and I want you to listen to this explosive opening paragraph.
We're talking about a man who once stood on top of the world, ruling music, fashion, business, even media. But now, he's sitting there in silence, hands shaking, unable to look anyone in the eye. Why? Because what the prosecution just laid out against him is beyond anything anyone saw coming. We've already heard rumors, seen whispers online, and gotten hints from former insiders.
Evidence of redacted, uncharged, and uncorroborated crimes, including redacted, again, it's all blacked out, purported instances of sexual assault, all but one of which supposedly occurred decades ago. These incendiary allegations are substantially more serious than the charged offenses, and if admitted, would make it impossible for Mr. Combs to receive a fair trial. Wow. Now, we'll get into the law on this and if prosecutors can actually introduce evidence of uncharged conduct. I mean, we've seen that before. We've seen that in other cases. Look at the Harvey Weinstein case, right? His first trial in New York, there was a whole big issue about bringing in evidence of uncharged conduct to establish a pattern of activity to help prove the crimes that he was charged with. We have seen that before in other criminal cases, again, involving sex crimes. But what could all this be about? Who is this about? Is this about salacious allegations in any of the civil lawsuits that Combs is facing? Could this include allegations that Combs abused minors? Again, part of the civil lawsuits? We don't know. It's all redacted. But clearly, you see the defense team on the defensive.
But now, prosecutors are pulling out the heavy artillery. And they've got documents, witnesses, and what appears to be a well-detailed timeline connecting Diddy to a network of activities that could land him behind bars for decades. What kind of activities, you ask? Let's start with the newest charge: conspiracy to commit criminal acts across state lines. They're talking about flights, phone calls, wire transfers.
The charges focus on allegations about domestic abuse or supposed economic coercion of longtime girlfriends. That is the case Mr. Combs has been defending for months. Yet now, on the eve of trial and after 2 superseding indictments, the government has surfaced a new plan to taint his trial with evidence about purported heinous acts redacted, including an allegation that redacted. These are entirely new, untested, uncorroborated, and uninvestigated allegations. All but one of the alleged incidents happened over 20 years ago, with the oldest dating to the 1980s. Some of the allegations are demonstrably false, but would nonetheless require an enormous amount of trial time to disprove. Some are truly unknown to the defense, and the government's disclosure has been utterly threadbare so far. The allegations implicate dozens of unidentified witnesses and alleged co-conspirators around the world, and some of the key witnesses to the supposed incidents are dead, basically meaning how can we defend against it? The defense is not even permitted to share the identities of the individuals described.
And the evidence? Prosecutors say they've obtained encrypted messages, flight logs, and eyewitness testimonies tying Diddy to secret operations that were anything but legal. And then it gets darker. According to the prosecution, Diddy allegedly used his influence to silence victims, manipulate legal outcomes, and orchestrate a pattern of systematic cover-ups that span over a decade.
Shouldn't be allowed in, that the prosecution should try the case that it charged, and that's it. You see, the reason is, generally speaking, prosecutors are not allowed to introduce evidence of someone's character or propensity or prior bad acts to suggest that the defendant did that, so it's more likely that he's guilty of this. And Combs argues that this evidence is not allowed under the federal rules of evidence, and I'll get into each one of the rules. So first up, Combs argues that this evidence shouldn't be allowed under Rule 413 of the Rules of Evidence. Now, Rule 413 states that in a criminal case in which a defendant is accused of a sexual assault, the court may admit evidence that the defendant committed any other sexual assault. The evidence may be considered on any matter to which it is relevant. But Combs argues he's not charged with sexual assault as an individual crime. And to support that argument, he goes into the language of the rule, prior court decisions, principles on how to interpret the rule, legislative history of the rule. I'm not going to bore you with all that, but the bottom line is he's not charged with sexual assault, and Rule 413, he claims, only applies.
This isn't just one or two incidents. This is organized. This is deep. And they're now calling it a pattern of behavior designed to maintain power at all costs. Inside sources say the courtroom gasped when prosecutors mentioned a list of new witnesses, people who had previously remained silent. Some were former employees. Others were once part of Diddy's tight-knit inner circle. And now, they're turning on him. And what really shook the courtroom?
Of this evidence. Rule 404 does not allow the admission of evidence to prove character and propensity. The other purposes in Rule 404b2 are non-propensity purposes. There is no conceivable non-propensity purpose here, and merely repeating the words of Rule 404b2 is not sufficient. So first, Combs argues that the government doesn't adequately provide notice of what their other intended purposes are for all of this redacted evidence, and that under the law, the defense needs to know what the prosecution plans to argue so they can properly respond and defend against it. And they basically say the prosecution is acting in bad faith. Quote, "It is obvious the government either intentionally withheld notice for the purpose of unfair surprise or was dilatory and negligent in its investigation. The government knows it is impossible to investigate these allegations in 60 days. Since the beginning of the case, the defense has been asking the government to identify alleged victims precisely so that Mr. Combs can investigate and prepare his defense. The government did not identify any of the individuals in its note."
A mention of a hidden vault. Yes, you heard that right. Prosecutors allege there is a private digital storage, hidden, encrypted, and protected, where videos, photos, and incriminating evidence were allegedly stored. This vault is said to contain footage from parties, voice memos, private conversations, and financial trails that could connect Diddy to more than just bad decisions.
But Combs doesn't just argue that the prosecution failed in the notice department, but they also argue there's no non-propensity purpose for introducing this evidence. Quote, "On their face, the proffered purposes do not even make sense. For example, the government suggests that all the prior acts show plan and preparation for the charged offenses. How does redacted show that the defendant was planning and preparing to commit a sex trafficking or Mann Act violation? That doesn't even make sense, as the proffered acts are not sufficiently similar to the conduct at issue to permit a reasonable inference of knowledge, intent, or plan." And then Sean Combs doubles down and argues against the idea that these prior alleged acts of violence against women can be used to prove intent to commit the charged acts involving violence against women. Combs argues that the only way the jury would find him guilty of the crimes he's facing based on these redacted prior acts would be if it found he had a propensity for violence against girlfriends and partners, and that is not allowed. Quote, "The government may say that the evidence is offered,
but serious crimes." And that's when Diddy broke down. He looked at his lawyers. He looked at the judge. And it said that for a split second, just one, he wasn't the confident mogul we've seen on red carpets. He was a man cornered. A man who knew that the house of cards was collapsing. And it wasn't just the public watching. It was his family, his team, and the world.
Will prejudice him so that the jury will feel the need to engage in preventive conviction even if he's innocent of the sex trafficking and racketeering charges. that they feel they have to do something. And really, Combs argues if this is the stuff that comes in and the jury will see it, they'll see him just as a bad guy who deserves punishment, particularly given the inflammatory nature and content of these allegations. Now, all of these uncharged acts, again, are redacted, so we have no idea what it is, but based on Combs' arguments, he alleges that it's all very different from what he's currently charged with. So with all that in mind, Combs' counsel explains that the evidence shouldn't be admitted, or at the very least a hearing is necessary before the evidence is admitted, because the government has not explained what it has, how it's going to prove these uncharged acts happened, and so forth. But then we move into the government's response. And they say as following, quote, "Since his arrest, the government has insisted that every victim in this case consented to every sex act the government has identified. Having made plain his intention to argue at trial that he believed every alleged coercive sex act was consensual."
Let's talk about the charges for a second. They include everything from racketeering and obstruction of justice to illegal surveillance and alleged involvement in transporting individuals across state lines under suspicious circumstances. Prosecutors claim that what started as a few isolated claims is now unraveling into one of the biggest scandals in the history of the entertainment industry. And here's where it gets even more wild. The judge in the case didn't hold back either.
Other victims into unwanted sex. It proves that the defendant intended to take the sexual gratification he wanted regardless of consent. So the government argues that the alleged sexual assaults of redacted, that it is admissible to help prove the criminal enterprise under the racketeering charge, because the idea is that this enterprise, this criminal enterprise, was set up to fulfill Combs' sexual desires, that the testimony of these alleged victims of uncharged acts shows intent under Rule 404b2, that he intended to coerce the victims in this criminal case into unwanted sexual activity, that this is a non-propensity purpose. Quote, "Given the graphic testimony that the statutory victims will collectively give about years' worth of beatings, drug-fueled coercive sex marathons, and multiple rapes," these are the people who will testify as part of the criminal charges, "the non-statutory victims' testimony," meaning the people who would testify as to this uncharged conduct, "will be no more inflammatory than the evidence that the jury will already have before it at this trial. Accordingly, the highly probative proffered testimony is..."
In a rare move, the judge addressed the court and stated that the pattern of behavior laid out in these filings suggests a systemic abuse of power that this court cannot ignore. That's not a light statement. That's a message, a warning, and a turning point. Because once the court starts recognizing systemic abuse of power, you better believe indictments are coming. And not just for Diddy. The prosecutors hinted that others could be charged as investigations continue. That means the inner circle, associates, co-conspirators.
Assault cases, other acts of sexual assault can be admitted. Now, the government, not surprisingly, disagrees with Combs' characterization that he isn't accused of sexual assault in this criminal case, so the rule doesn't apply. The government responds and claims the commercial sex acts as part of the transportation to engage in prostitution charge he's facing and the underlying sex trafficking allegations in the racketeering charge he's facing and the forced labor allegations, they all contain multiple sexual assaults. That's what this is about. You don't have to be charged with sexual assault. He's been accused of sexual assault as part of this criminal case. Next, the government argues that this evidence is also admissible under Rule 404b. Again, the evidence of other crimes, wrongs, bad acts to prove something other than propensity. Again, intent, motive, knowledge, absence of mistake. So namely, they make the argument that Combs had the intent to sex traffic these victims in his current criminal case and coerce all four of these victims to engage in forced labor. And
people who stayed silent or played their part. No one is safe. And let's not forget what Diddy's legal team is doing right now. They're scrambling. One insider described the scene backstage as chaotic, with phones ringing, documents flying, and lawyers pacing back and forth trying to figure out how to respond to the new charges. Some are even saying Diddy might attempt to strike a deal to reduce sentencing. But with this mountain of evidence, that won't be easy.
Again, this uncharged act, this alleged prior bad act, that is used to prove he knew that his victims didn't consent, that he intended to sexually gratify himself regardless of consent, and there was no mistake when engaging in non-consensual sex acts. In other words, it is evidence we need to prove our underlying crimes in the indictment. Quote, the defendant's history of refusing to take no for an answer and intentionally seeking to gratify his own sexual desires, regardless of consent, strongly supports the inference that he had the same mindset, the same intent when coercing the statutory victims to engage in the charged sexual activity here. And then in a similar fashion, evidence that the defendant knew the non-statutory victims did not want to engage in sexual activity supports the inference that he knew or recklessly disregarded the fact that he was causing the statutory victims to engage in sex acts against their will. Thus, when the defendant inevitably argues at trial that he had no clue these 4 women did not want the sexual experiences that he demanded, the government...
People close to the case also say Diddy's mental state is deteriorating. He's reportedly not sleeping, barely eating, and increasingly paranoid about who's flipping on him next. And with new headlines dropping every day, some claiming more video leaks, others hinting at ties to even more underground activities, he's spiraling. Let's go deeper. According to a former associate who spoke under condition of anonymity, Diddy's so-called inner circle wasn't just a crew.
Were intended to have consensual, loving sexual experiences with the statutory victims, the government should be able to point out his repeated intent to sexually gratify himself with unwilling participants. So they are trying to establish that this pattern is important in proving the crimes here. And also, quote, evidence of the defendant's other sexual abuse proves the absence of mistake. Again, one of these non-propensity purposes. Quote, the government anticipates that the defendant may seek to argue that he mistakenly believed himself to be engaging in consensual sex acts with the statutory victims, or that his conduct was invited by his sexual partners. But redacted, including in the presence of or with third parties, such testimony therefore makes plain that the defendant did not act inadvertently or due to a misconception that his sexual partners were willing participants in this conduct. Oh, and by the way, you remember that whole argument that the government didn't provide the proper notice to Sean Combs about what it plans to argue about this evidence? Well, the government responds, and they claim we provided the names of anonymous witnesses to the defense on March 17, 2025, meaning we gave the defense enough information to understand what's going on here. Then we move on to the probative value argument that I mentioned before, that the probative value of the defendant's...
It was a machine. Every piece had a role. Some handled media cover-ups, some kept tabs on people Diddy considered threats, and others, they handled the dirty work. Whispers of offshore accounts, hush payments, and non-disclosure agreements are now surfacing in official court documents. Some of these NDAs are said to be so ironclad, they included lifetime clauses. But now, witnesses are breaking those agreements, saying they can no longer live with the guilt.
Decades worth of beatings, drug-fueled sex marathons, and multiple rapes, the non-statutory victim's testimony will be no more inflammatory than other evidence the jury will hear. Given the defense's likely arguments and attacks on victim credibility in this case, and the highly probative nature of the defendant's other sexual assault and abuse evidence on the defendant's knowledge, any potential prejudice under Rule 403 is easily outweighed. This is important evidence, it's relevant, it's important evidence, and it's important in establishing the crimes that we are alleging. And finally, the government argues that a hearing is unnecessary and inappropriate. Quote, although the defendant slings plenty of mud about the non-statutory victims' accounts, he has yet to produce any contrary evidence and did not attach it to his motion. By contrast, the government has provided detailed proffers of each victim's anticipated testimony and corroborating evidence. Further, the accounts of the non-statutory victims and those of the statutory victims corroborate each other. This corroboration, together with the detailed proffers of each victim's anticipated testimony, is sufficient to satisfy Rule 104's low threshold for reliability. Now, I imagine the defense would say,
and here's the bombshell. One of those witnesses is reportedly someone who worked with Diddy for over a decade, managing his travel logistics. That individual is now working with federal agents and has provided flight manifests, detailed records that allegedly show trips connected to illicit activities. That same witness also turned over emails and text messages, some involving major celebrities. While names haven't been publicly released yet, the implication is clear.
We actually have a reply from Combs. Combs' counsel argues that the government is doing a bait and switch. At first, the government said, oh, this evidence is very different. But then, when Combs' counsel challenged it, Now the government says, wait, this is actually direct evidence of the crimes that Combs is charged with. And they double down on the argument they made in the previous filing for why this is substantially prejudicial and it should be inadmissible. That the government knew about these alleged victims for a long time, that it should have explained a while ago why it was relevant and admissible, and they accuse the government of springing all of this on them, surprising them all with this. That it is impossible for them to competently investigate and prepare for a trial that will include this new evidence. And that is especially true, they argue, because in RICO, or racketeering cases, Combs, like other defendants, there is a need to be specific and particularized for the defendant. They have to know what these allegations are. And if these new allegations are probative of the racketeering charge, the government would have had to say so earlier. Quote, "The redacted are not direct evidence of the alleged enterprise, its purpose or means and methods, or the charged pattern of racketeering."
More people are going down with Diddy. The pressure is on. Prosecutors know they're handling one of the most high-profile cases in recent memory. And they're building it brick by brick, piece by piece, determined to leave no stone unturned. And let's talk about the public. Fans are divided. Some can't believe the allegations. Others say they're not surprised, pointing out years of strange behavior, odd interviews, and unexplained incidents swept under the rug. Social media is flooded with clips of Diddy's past comments.
Well, go back 3 years ago. Can't believe it's been 3 years, but you go back 3 years ago, and you remember the defamation trial of Johnny Depp and Amber Heard back in Virginia? Well, she was called by the actress to opine on her mental health and whether or not Amber Heard was exhibiting signs of, in fact, being abused, because Heard had been sued by Depp for falsely accusing him of abusing her.
Did you arrive at any expert opinions?
Yes, I did.
All right. I would like to start with your main expert opinions and then go through those. Can you please tell the jury what your main opinions were?
So like I said, there are opinions embedded within them, but the main opinion is that Ms. Heard's report of intimate partner violence and the records that I reviewed is consistent with what we know in the field about intimate partner violence, characterized by physical violence, psychological aggression, sexual violence, coercive control, and surveillance behaviors.
And what was the other main opinion that you had?
The second main opinion was that that Ms. Heard.
Old videos that now seem eerily suspicious, and threads connecting dots that were once ignored. And now, with the court case exploding, the court of public opinion is already passing judgment. But here's the real kicker. Legal analysts say this case could spark a domino effect across the industry. If Diddy falls, others might too. This case is becoming a roadmap.
Dr. Hughes is a clinical psychologist and a board-certified forensic psychologist, and a leading expert on sexual abuse, interpersonal violence, victimization, and traumatic stress. The following includes the anticipated opinions the government expects Dr. Hughes will offer regarding sexual abuse and victim responses to sexual abuse, coercive control, coping strategies during and in relation to sexual abuse, delayed disclosure, and memory of sexual abuse. Quote, the government expects that Dr. Hughes will testify about coercive control as a tactic of victimization, i.e. the state to process of becoming a victim, and a strategy to gain dominance across a spectrum of relationships. Coercive control often includes a variety of physical, sexual, and/or emotional tactics that together function to control the victim. More specifically, Dr. Hughes will explain that these tactics may include, among other things, the following: actual or threatened physical violence, aggression, sexual assault and abuse, sexual degradation, micro-regulation, financial and economic control, control over reproductive health, control through the use of drugs or alcohol, physical and emotional isolation from pre-existing support networks and external influence, use of collateral or damaging or
showing how deep the rot runs in an industry built on fame, money, and secrecy. So, what's next? Another hearing is scheduled for next week. Prosecutors say even more charges could be announced. Defense lawyers are bracing for more damning evidence. And Diddy? He's on the edge. This isn't just about prison time. This is about legacy, influence, power, and what happens when it all finally catches up to you. So buckle up, because we are witnessing the collapse of an empire in real time. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Is Diddy done for? Or will he find a way to escape justice once again? Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this story, it's not even close to over. And the next chapter might just be the most explosive yet. Stay tuned.